Okay, and this is an interview for the Letras Latinas Oral History Project. Before we get into the first question, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'd like to get a flavor of the novel. So I'm going to ask you to read that passage that I told you about. And this is from your novel, The Region of Lost Names, which was published by University of Arizona Press. I believe it was last year, wasn't it?
Yes, 2008.
And if you want, before you read the passage, you want to just, contextualize it a tiny bit, that'd be fine as well.
This is the story, in many ways the novel has its beginnings in the 60s with a group of Puerto Rican men handful of Puerto Rican men that come to this small town in Michigan to work at a mushroom cannery. But I'm starting the novel more near the present day with two main characters, Magdalene and Ernest, who are the sons and daughters of different men who came here to work, who basically have sort of like no past or memory or origins to return to, and they're really unclear about where the future is. And even though Ernest knew his father very well, he's in a sense really trying to understand his father's silence, etc., his life, where he comes from, whereas Magdalene doesn't know who her father is at all. Were friends as children. They eventually become lovers. And they have a child together, but they're separated. And she's in Puerto Rico, and he is in northern Michigan. And this is a moment in the book where he's starting to figure out what he can actually do to get Magdalene to come back to Michigan, even though he's been trying and she has not been willing to come back. And I think as the past makes clear, part of it is he has to come to a sense of himself, but he can only do it by becoming a part of a community. And that's really what this passage is about. Every Monday morning, I arrived at La Habana for coffee at the front table by the window. And I'd arrive once or twice a week in the evening for dinner, La Habana becoming a refuge always filled with Mr. Vargas's warmth and joy. Mr. Vargas had moved here long ago when there were no Hispanics except for a few hundred or so migrants who came in the summer to work in the fields and orchards. He told me one day that in Havana he ran a market, and so a market it would be here in this little building next to the freshwater sea. He could tell right away that Latin Caribbean foodstuffs would never sell enough to make him a living in this town. So he began with a simple market: milk, cheese, eggs, canned goods, a few vegetables, and fruits, and fresh-baked bread. That first summer of business, Mr. Vargas noticed all the tourists, along with those from Chicago and Detroit who owned homes in the area. He decided to specialize in Italian foods. He put in a deli too and made sandwiches to order. "Chico," he said, "business never let up. Pasta, 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 every day with the olive oil, the roasted red peppers, the pork sausage, the big cans of plum tomatoes." He always had a small Hispanic aisle, but once the local Mexican population began to take hold and more migrants arrived to work, he started selling an array of foodstuffs: sazon, chorizo, dried chilies, yuca, and cassava, 5 kinds of dried beans, avocados, mangoes, those pink and yellow soaps from his childhood that came from Bogota and Port of Spain. He even hired a Mexican woman to make fresh tortillas, roasted adobo chicken, tamales and burritos, menudo, and my favorite, which takes its name from the name of the store, La Habana, slow roasted pork, ham, Swiss cheese, olive oil, and garlic, pickles and mustard, all placed between 2 pieces of French bread and grilled. Reynaldo, sitting next to Mrs. La Casa, waved a fork in the air, a plate of rice and black beans in front of him. I waved back with my free hand, raised the platter of pasteles in the other, and gave him a grimace like, "I have to fill this order," still thinking about the place Mr. Vargas had created for himself, and how I longed for my own sense of home to take shape here, around these people, the smell of garlic and pepper and cilantro wafting through the air, the noise of silverware against dishes, and the conversation and laughter, the feeling of my feet solid and straight on the floor. Here, in this place, alongside Isabel and Magdalene. Reynaldo and Mrs. La Casa smiled. I stepped forward, reached the table on the far left, and placed the platter in the middle, removing an invisible hat from my head, bending a little at the waist, my hat in my hand upturned and held just on the edge of the table. "Thank you," they said in unison. I felt a hand on my back. "Ay, Ernestito, you made it." When I turned, Gonzalo handed me a short glass of rum, and we shook hands. "Salud," I said, and we clinked glasses. The smell of rum was strong, and my stomach rolled, filled with the sharp scent of the alcohol and my earlier dry heaves. I raised the glass more slowly, searching for the sugar, the lemon, the buttery pineapple, the glass against my lips. I waited for the rum's lemon to wake up my tongue, and then the sugar came through, and the hotness of it all slowly and smoothly made its way deep into the pocket of my stomach. I almost moaned, and my arms shook a little, but my feet felt heavier and steadier on the floor, and I knew I'd be okay. I tasted how clear and clean the rum was, and my stomach continued to warm, and my eyes became clearer, brighter. You want me to keep going?
Yeah.
Gonzalo took my arm and led me over the table, He asked, "Did you have a hard time finding the place?" We sat down. "No, not at all." "You know of this place?" he asked, his eyes wide, the right side of his mustache turned up with his expression, his cheekbones high and turning a reddish brown, perhaps from the rum, perhaps from the warming spring sun. In his dark brown eyes I could see the wonder and the depth of his attention and concern for the exactness of the moment, a quality that was present each time he spoke with me. I smiled, felt a small wash of shame fill my stomach. I wanted his eyes, his attention. I no longer wanted to turn away with apprehension and shyness when I spoke to others, especially Gonzalo. Perhaps to some this wasn't much to begin to stake my life on, but it was a beginning I needed and admired, to get up every morning, to work a full day without regret, and to provide for others comforts they had never had to ask for. Mrs. La Casa set a plate of chicken and rice in front of me. I waved my hand in front of the rising steam, let the olive oil and garlic waft into my nose, the salt and pepper, the saffron-stained chicken, the lemon. "Thank you, Julieta." She patted my shoulder. "Sure," I said, staring into Gonzalo's eyes. "I come here all the time. Pero Gonzalo, you always talk of forgetting Cuba, moving farther and farther away, so I never mentioned this place to you." "Of course, I see." Gonzalo raised his hands in a way that said, "No harm done." Julieta handed Gonzalo his plate. He and I began to eat, and between bites he told me, "I believe that's what I wanted, and I thought forgetting was easy. Workers at the cannery asked me many days to lunch here. I always declined." Mr. Vargas came over to the table, the glistening piece of pork on a silver tray. He placed it on a table to oohs and ahs. The white tablecloth seemed tiled and colorful, distinctly individual pieces, a charred pan filled with a mound of white rice, a deep yellow bowl of black beans, the golden corn surrounded by brown garlic cloves and thick slices of lemon and split red onions, the platter of pork with its glistening, crispy skin, speckled with coarse bits of black pepper beginning to spill onto each other. "I thought I could avoid my reasons, my hate for leaving Cuba," Gonzalo said. "Move as far away as possible." But my mother was still there. I smelled and tasted the place on my skin, no matter how many times I showered. I realized, talking to you, seeing how Reynaldo is growing up so quickly, I understood it was not fair to deny him that past, his past, No? I shook my head, shrugged, didn't want to answer, but let him tell me. There are many places I know he will never see. I will have to tell him about them. And hell, what was I thinking? Gonzalo picked up a chicken leg and bit into it. I had to eat. We both laughed, wiped our greasy lips. Gonzalo filled our glasses 3/4 full with rum. We raised them and drank. This time my stomach beginning to fill with rice and beans, my mouth alive with cilantro and pepper, my nausea pushed aside, the rum welcome, my stomach dancing with lemons and pineapples, an almond tree, and then the sea. An older woman approached wearing a long green dress with yellow mango paisleys scattered about. Her silver hair pulled back tight off her smooth forehead, and on her open hand there rested a plate. Abuela la casa. With her silver hair, she must have been close to 80, I thought, and yet her skin, the color of a new penny, was smooth as butter, like butter beginning to melt on a warm summer day, her skin ageless. It was her hands, dry and cracked, and her fingers, wrinkled and twisted, that showed her years. She opened her free hand on Gonzalo's shoulder. He took her wrist, looking up into her face. She bent down and kissed him on the forehead. Then the lips. For you, Ernestito. Abuela reached across the table and handed me the plate filled with roast pork, and on the side a piece of crispy skin. My favorite. Thank you. It's good to meet you, Señora La Casa. For me as well. I've heard a lot about you. Thank you for getting to know my family. It was more them letting me become a part of their lives, like I'm a distant cousin. I picked up my glass, tapped the side with my knife. Everyone turned and then raised their glasses when I raised mine. Wait, wait, I said, and yelled over to Mr. Vargas, who was setting a plate on a table. He turned and looked at us, and then made his way to our table, rubbing his hands together. I poured him a short glass of rum, stood, handed it to him. I raised my glass again. For safe arrivals, the reunions of families, and for tomorrow, the beginning of more moments like this very evening. Family, friends, food, and the drink of choice, love.
Beautiful. When I read your novel, I actually read it when I was in Santa Fe. That scene to me seemed to encapsulate. It seems almost like, in some ways, the heart of the novel, for me anyway. And I really enjoyed how you portrayed that community. And I wanted to ask you, before I read your novel, I never really had thought of Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Michigan. We always hear more about Mexican migration to various parts of the country. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about, I think you did at the beginning when you talked about your biography, but if you could elaborate on how you came to hone in on Cuban and Puerto Rican migration to that area of the country for this novel.
Well, I think to go back to a little bit of what I was saying is that I'm interested in this whole facet in my own writing as like how there's just these submerged populations all over America. And these people exist and they work and they're a part of the community, but they're just sort of submerged because they're unrecognized. So when I was growing up, there was these Puerto Rican men around this town, and my father knew them, but I didn't know a lot of who they were. And the Green Giant Cannery still existed, and I would go out there to pick up my mother's sister. I was just a little kid in the car, go get my aunt, and you'd see this big jolly green giant in the window. And that was always there. And as I grew older, it went out of business and all the buildings were crumbling. It was just like ruins, and I would constantly drive by it, so I was always reminded of it. And then we bought a house on 3rd Street, and the house directly across the street from us, the euphemism I give to it now is the Puerto Rican house. And it was a house that was all these men that were, it seemed like shipwrecked here. They were single. They drank a lot. They sat on the porch, tell stories. I would go out and play, and they just seemed to
And they were Puerto
always,
Rican?
yeah. They would always just sort of look at me playing, and sometimes I would go over there, and some of them would still wear the green helmets that they used to wear with lights that they worked in the green giant cannery growing the mushrooms. So that was always a part, trying to kind of understand that story. How was it that my dad at such a young age, he came to the United States, worked in New York for a while, and then heard this call, and him and a friend of his, they came here to Michigan, to work. Met my mother, who was in high school, etc., and started this whole family, and other men did the same.
What about the Cuban element?
So they were part of the community. And then the Cuban element is probably, in some ways, it was part of the obsessive nature of what was happening in my life at the time when I was working on the book in the beginning, and that was just that I was visually engaged with these stories about people like on this mass exodus from Cuba trying to make it to America, on rafts, on boats, with, a gallon of water.
So then the character of Gonzalo, being Cuban in that community, that was something that you sort of added to the mix?
Yes, because I had to have a counterpoint to make it that Ernest had to come to terms with the fact that everything that he was dealing with wasn't as difficult as he thought. And it's also just a counterpoint for myself that I want to write, I'm writing about these things, I'm discovering them at times, but I have to understand that I have a lot of privilege in doing it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people that I write about, their lives are much more tougher than mine is. So as it is in the book, as Ernest kind of understands about Gonzalo, is that, Gonzalo had to go through, his family, they had to go through like a literal hunger. Like literally hungry at times. They had to give up, their family back there. They had to give up their Spanish language in many ways. They had to exile some of their memories forever. So that's sort of like what brought that in there.
So what kind of reaction, this book has been out for a while now, and you've given readings, I imagine. Have you gotten any reaction about this element that I found very, very refreshing, the Cuban Puerto Rican element in the Midwest? Have you gotten what kind of reactions have you gotten from readers as you've been promoting the book?
Well, first, that first response is, I never knew that there were Puerto Ricanos in Michigan, and I would just think it'd be Mexicans working there and so forth. So it highlights that submerged element. I think that the other element too is, which it's not a conscious thing, but I have these characters 10 miles from here, and they're actually living like a border existence.
So a border existence?
Yeah, because, they're ostracized in a community and live on the margins or in a border. But then, like, there's a literal border here. Is like when you grow up in that part of Michigan, work and life takes place there, but like a lot of economy and stuff, it was coming to Indiana, so you're always caught in between that, this Michiana area. And that's a response that people have had, is that you're not writing about we think of that when you write about the border, you need to be writing about the Southwest, so Texas and Arizona, etc. And your work is interesting because you have those elements, but it's not down there in the Southwest on the border. So it gives them a chance to see that there are all these sort of internal borders within the U.S. too. More importantly, though, that there's all these layers of migration and immigration inside America, but we have to pay attention to it, see it.
Well, thinking about that, so in that sense then your book, in my view, is sort of breaking ground by talking about these borders in the interior. So when you set out to take on a subject like this, could you talk a little bit about who some of the writers or works of literature may have served as a model for doing this book?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important to understand that, I think to Latino writers, we have a various amount of different experiences and what kind of literature and writers speak to us. I'm not sure that my experience is unique, but I didn't go to college till I was like almost 23, and when I went, after having kind of miserable high school, I should have never been in college, but with some support and some ideas that I had, a kind of dream, I decided to start going to school while I was working. And I went, and as soon as I went, I was a remedial student. I couldn't pass English. So I had to take the basic writing and had to pass that before I could do anything. I think I failed it the first time. Then the second time I got an A. And then eventually became an English major. So there was literally no books in our house. There was no literature. I can only really remember reading when I was younger in Connecticut. I can remember reading The Red Badge of Courage and Huck Finn. And there's an encyclopedia I like to read. But other than that, I don't have a kind of education or background that has to do with reading.
Yeah.
But one of the first things I read when I was just started reading was, I just came upon works by Jimmy Santiago Baca.
So poetry.
Yeah. Okay. And I just started with that poetry. It was primal.
Do you remember which book?
Immigrants in Our Own Land.
Okay.
And that whole, that just, boom. Again, my experience is totally different his, but I was that just struck me, that metaphor he was using, that we are made to feel like immigrants in our own land. We were here before and all that. So his work, and he has a book of essays that really hit me hard, and that's called Working in the Dark. They have his journals in there and various essays. There's a really good essay he has called Coming into Language, which is basically his prison narrative about how he learned to write in English and then become a poet while still in prison. That book was published while he was in prison, actually, still in prison. So there was that, and there was things like Sandra Cisneros' Women Hollering Creek. That book meant a lot to me. Anaya's Bless Me Ultima. I had read some Gary Soto, read Richard Rodriguez, but it was just a few things. But I think that the main things, one of the sort of watershed books was, which I would argue is a mestizo book. The great American work of art is Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. And that book, this is how illiterate I was in some ways. I read that book, and she had over and over again the word arroyo. And I had grown up all my life people not pronouncing it correctly, asking what is that name, what does it mean? Yeah. And I have no idea what it means. And I was just used to it being mispronounced, and it was always a weird thing because the name equaled almost nothing. Yeah. My father would never talk about it. And why would he? But I'm reading that book, and she repeats it over and over again because it's such a important thing of the landscape. But then it becomes the central metaphor, really, of that book, and that is that in the middle of the book and the kind of middle point of the novel is the scene where the little boy's down in the arroyo where all the homeless people are at, and he's just in squalor, crap, urine, all this mud, and his mother's working as a prostitute, and he's crawling all around in there. And that becomes a central metaphor for her, I think, is that one of the ways to read the book is she's trying to understand what it means to be an arroyo in the sense of being totally empty and dry, a dry gully, no life at all.
So an arroyo, but in a sense, a waterless.
Exactly, yes. But then that's what's needed is water, that cycle of life. And then I read that, and I had a personal response to that because of that name, but then because of the way that she wrote the book, I learned so much about how to sort of form art and experience from Ceremony, and the storytelling, right? That storytelling is for healing, and it's a continual process that it is a mestizo process that has to continuously change, and people add things to it that make it different. We can't go back to the origins. So that book was really important in that way.
So you've mentioned, Jimmy Santiago Baca, Sandra Cisneros' Women Hollering Creek, Ceremony, any others?
Yes.
For this particular project?
Oh, yeah. The two main books probably for this project, which are going to be this odd combination, but the first one would be Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. So she grew up on island Dominica. So White Sargasso Sea is basically, one way it's a rewriting of Jane Eyre. And the first half of the book is just childhood on that Caribbean island from the woman's perspective. It's very beautiful and lush. The writing is very similar to my writing. I try to aspire to be very similar like that. And then she shifts to perspective male. So she's got these dual perspectives. One seems hot, one seems cold.
So
but
the technique of shifting back and
yeah,
forth comes
I learned
from
I learned a lot from that. But I learned a lot from her that I learned a lot about the English language and what I could do with writing and grammar and sentences. Just follow a lot, and that helped me to become a stylist.
What was the other book?
Well, then the other book is like an movement of that, and that's Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of a Lion. So he's started as a poet. He's from Sri Lanka, but immigrated to Canada. Yeah. And like that book is like, for Canada, it's like the great immigrant experience novel.
That's a novel, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you read Running in the Family?
Oh yeah, that's another, that's the other book.
Nonfiction.
Yeah. But in The Skin of the Lion, it's like the Macedonians who come to Toronto and they help build the city. And I just thought it was so, amazing that he has an immigrant experience, but he said it historically, and then he writes about Macedonia and something totally different. And the structure of the book, the pacing of it, it helped me a lot with this book. Both of them have a kind of fragmentary nature to them, and that sort of helped me a lot. Okay. I even traveled to Toronto and retraced a lot of the book and saw the things, and so it's a book I read a lot. And he's a writer I read a lot because I want to write more. I mean, I'd like for my work to to aspire to the level of what he does. But anyway.
You mentioned water as an image, and I wanted to comment on another image that I noticed, and that was on more than at least 2 occasions, there's this image in the book of the man lying on the ground drunk, and how that image seems to have a traumatic effect on some of the children in the novel, like Isabel. And it recurred enough for me to notice it, that in more than one scene we have this sort of image of the prostrate man passed out and drunk. And I'm wondering if you could say something about that image, if that was something that, is it possible that in an earlier version there were more versions of it and you edited it out? Because it seemed almost deliberate that this was sort of one of the key images that reoccurs in the book. I think there's an image that happens in Puerto Rico, and there's one that happens in the U.S.
Yeah.
There's a lying on the ground image in both places.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that in the process it was first deliberate, but then that's the way that I work. Is often I'm trying to construct certain scenes, and I'll discover a kind of deep image that underlies them. And I got to figure out how to place them in the book, and they can be very far apart, and yet it'll create a leap for the reader, and they'll subconsciously they might become super conscious of it, but they may not. But it creates that kind of meaning. But those are real images. Those are the primal images I've dealt with all my life, and that's just seeing men drunk laying on the ground like that. And one man so drunk that that he fell down and no one knew that he died. So those are just always there with me, and I think that for young writers, it's especially with the whole apparatus of education, that we think of writing as something that you learn via knowledge and technique, but although knowledge and technique have been very important to me, it's still more like of the primal impulse to actually write and what drives one to write. That we're all struggling with demonic obsessions, a demonic impulse, and that demonic obsession often comes from these kind of like primal moments that are there in our lives. So I was always trying to write this primal moment. And it was just that my father had taken me to Puerto Rico when I was very young, and he took me to this festival, and he had been drinking so much that, and we were walking in this festival, and we got separated. And when we got separated, I couldn't find him, and so I was lost.
Yeah.
And it's like my second day there, so I'm just totally lost. And I guess I was maybe 6 or 7.
Yeah.
But luckily, because so many people at that time in the '70s, I mean, they really knew each other. These people walked by and they knew that I was there visiting,
Yeah.
and they're like, "What are you doing?" So they gave me a ride home. And the weirdest thing was that they gave me a ride home and it was late, and my grandmother was waiting at the end of the barrio in this corner waiting for me to come home with my dad, and she saw me in the car, so I went home with her. Then, like, as the time went by, the weeks, he went and did certain things a lot, by himself, and I spent more time with my grandmother. And one night she took me to another barrio. We walked over the mountain and came down to a parranda, big Christmas celebration. And we were there, and there was a man laying underneath a tree with just a pair of pants on and no shirt, asleep underneath a tree, and everyone was gathered around him. And it was pitch black, but there was all these lamps and lights because of the nativity scenes that they do and everything, And I just remember her, she kept calling my father's name, and I was in the back. I was in the back thinking that, oh my God, that is my father laying on the ground. And this man jumped up, and it wasn't my father. But that sort of primal moment had stayed with me.
Mm-hmm.
And without having any education, without having no knowledge of what literature was, I knew when I first started writing that if you could write that moment out, that is a moment of like self-awareness and tragedy. It's what makes literature. So
Okay.
I just had to write it.
This is a good segue from image to character, and I want to ask you a question about a character in your novel, which from my reader's perspective, I felt like I would have liked to know more about because of the circumstances that you place this character in, and that is the character of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, Lorim.
Lorime. That's how I, for me.
It's a secondary character. We don't know much about him, but the novel seems to suggest that his death was a result of a gay bashing. That's the language that seems to suggest that. But we don't learn much about him in the way, say, that we do about Juan, another secondary character, who also ends up dying. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your intentions were with Lori May's character and how he ended up in this novel.
Well, in part, it's part of the whole backstory that eventually got sort of cut from the novel, and that was that there was the 3 young men, Ernest, Juan, and Lori May, that were really close friends, but they all had like separate identities and separate issues that they were dealing with. So that part of that was lost. So yeah, you're right. I mean, Lori May is a victim of a hate crime. But what I discovered more and more in dealing with the book is that like I didn't want to like avoid like difficult subjects or taboo things, and so part of this for me is that I grew up in a culture where the outer view is that like to be a Latino man is to be very macho, and people don't understand the negativity of that machismo that starts to emasculate young men. And what I mean by that is like, so the character is named Boogaloo. The reason that he's named Boogaloo is because just like every other person, you had like a nickname. And the nickname was a way to, erase your identity and then to give you a name that in some ways poked fun, was critical, made a joke in some ways. So there's always that in the culture, the jokiness, the example, that just always ingrained with me is that in my father's family, like all the young men they look alike, but there's a difference, but some skin color is different. And I can just remember that the darker brother in the car, and then you'd see a much darker person, and they would just like chide him and say, you know, mira negro, there's your brother. You know? And that was just to be funny. But yet in my mind, living in the racist country that I grew up in, that always struck me as like, that's a way to be, you know, masculine, and yet at the same time it's sort of emasculating someone else. So that was something I was dealing with. So Lori Mae was just a character, you know, someone like anyone that I would have known who was different, maybe a little effeminate. And I wanted to deal with that element that, like, even though Ernest and Magdalene loved Lori Mae, he was a friend, they would sometimes be implicated in this by saying certain things like that, calling him, you know, preciosa, linda, just stuff like that, and how they had to deal now with the fact, the shame, the anger, the pain, that even though they didn't literally have anything to do with him being killed, they contributed to it in some little way.
So is this a case then, because if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the novel suggests that he was a victim of a gay bashing, but the novel, the narrator in the novel, there's never actually any definitive evidence that Lori Mae was or wasn't gay, but that he had these outward characteristics
Exactly.
that might be associated
Yes.
with being gay. Because I read one of the reviews of your novel, I think it was the Tucson Weekly, identified him as a gay character, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
well, he wasn't exactly identified as a gay character, but there was a suggestion that he may have been gay
Exactly.
because of this exterior
Yes.
behavior,
Yes.
which is interesting because it makes me think about what happened in Long Island not too long
Just
ago.
a few weeks ago, yeah, the Ecuadorian
The
man,
Ecuadorian man
yeah.
who was
Walking with his
killed,
brother.
walking with his brother, and I think they mistook him for perhaps being gay.
They were coming from a church celebration,
Yeah.
but one was in a tank top, I guess, and they had taken off their jackets, they may have been drinking, but they were walking like arm in arm around, because they were brothers and they hadn't seen each other in a while. Yes, and these people just pulled up and, you know.
Huh, that's interesting. So you sort of leave it up, I mean, I guess, so that's interesting. So you're playing with this idea then of being mistaken for this other person and falling victim to a hate crime, even though that person wasn't.
Yeah, that it's not clear.
Yeah.
It's never, you know, exactly, it's not ever explicitly, you know, named or said in that way. So it's just another example that metaphor, the region of lost names, you know, is, I'm dealing with, in my mind, I'm dealing with men who gave their bodies and their sweat and their bones to this land, this region, they worked in it. But over and over again, like their names and their identity were sort of erased. And that happens, it relates to what you're saying. I mean, that's how it happens, is like hate leads to that. Like people start hating someone and it's because a mistaken thing. They don't know the truth of them. It's an assumption about something.
And of course,
It's a superficial
Taking it a
element.
step further, one could also say, though, but even if it were the case, if it turns out that Lori Mae was gay, it's not licensed to
Exactly.
carry out that kind of
Exactly,
that
yes.
kind of brutality.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's the manifestation of like words. I mean, right, words are a form of symbolic action. So as soon as you call someone a greaser, as soon as you call someone a wetback, there is a level of hate there, which symbolically you would like to do something to them. Right? I mean, that's why as writers we carefully choose our words, because we're not like regular people. We just don't say anything flippantly and let it go out into the air. Because even though a person could say something like that and not have a deep physical motivation to do some kind of harm, but once you release that into the air, it allows someone else to pick it up, like a germ,
Yeah.
you know, to become contagious with it, you know, and then do something.
I couldn't help but notice, as the novel progressed, Ernest's relationship to books and literature, and how acquiring education for both characters, is very significant. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this theme, books, literature, and how it applies, and you've begun to touch upon it, how it may have applied to your own trajectory as a writer, who also teaches now, currently, in a university setting. And so this is sort of a long way of saying, how did you come to writing?
Well, I mean, I came to writing by accident, by trying to go to school. It was just, I had a teacher in this basic writing class who let me keep a journal, and I just started writing things. Like, it was just immediately that I had some kind of raw talent for language. I assume it's because of growing up in a bilingual household, having a difficult education because of that, those two languages. And so immediately when I was given a chance to write, like, all kinds of things came in my mind that I could just write. Mm-hmm. I think also because, like, I'm a physical, sort of sensual kind of person. So that tactileness came to the words.
And so a teacher identified your talent?
Yeah.
And so?
Just she would just, like, mark things and talk about, why are you writing about that? This is interesting. I took this class with her, and I had overheard from some other source that James Joyce was a good writer, and that a good story was Araby. And so it was in the anthology, and I read it. So I said, I want to write my paper on Araby. And she said, well, what do you want to write about that story? And I think I remember, like, well, I like the way that he uses, like, like purple color, and there's this light and dark stuff going on. Well, what does that mean? And then we just started talking, and she just was really nurturing in, like, things I was talking about, and then I could write it. And it was a totally different way than, like, saying, okay, you're in this basic writing class because you're not competent enough to write English grammar, and we didn't do, like, sentence diagramming. We just actually wrote a lot. Mm-hmm. And so she nurtured that. So that's part of it. But I mean, the deeper thing to your question is that was the love of my, language and writing, learning. I mean, that's just the love of my life. Yeah. It's really what opened up. I had no idea what my life would be like. Like, when I imagined my life, I thought it would be, heavy worker, heavy drinker, shiftless, moving around a lot. Yeah. Because that's all my childhood was, always just moving around. I thought that's how life would be. But once I started, like, writing and discovering a kind of stability in that, mm-hmm. and reading books, and it opening a new door for me, and what I could do with learning. And
how did you transition? Because you just described a scenario where you wanted to write about a short story by James Joyce. How did you transition from that kind of writing to being a creator of your own literature, and not writing about literature?
It was just like an impulsive, immediate thing. Like, so and it still stays with me. I mean, you read that, and something that's well written, it just drives you to say, how could you create that as well? And all of a sudden, a scenario, a basic story material, some fabula comes in your mind, and you just start writing out the narrative. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it did, Mm-hmm. And I had a weird kind of imaginative sort of dream reality that I had spent so much of my young years sort of feeling like, belittled, and feeling, that I was stupid, being told that. There was just such a vast silence, in our house. Lots of anger about stuff that you don't understand because you're just a child. Yeah. And then you're just more and more isolated. Mm-hmm. And you just live in that sort of interior world. And then when you shifted...
Did books and reading, did books and reading and writing, was that a refuge from the stuff that was going on at home that you didn't understand? Was it a refuge?
Well, it couldn't be at that time, but it was afterwards. Yeah. I mean, I would, yeah.
And yet your first published book is a novel. Have you been writing short stories as well?
Yes. I mean, first, like, following off, like, Woman Hollering Creek, mm-hmm. Which is interesting because, like, I think in Spanish that's something like Los mujeres gritan arroyo. And it was the same thing. I was reading that book and I was like, wow, you know, those are great stories. But like that cycledness of stories. So that's what I was doing was, I think it's Edward Rivera's Family Installments. So it's these New York, Puerto Rico, New York, Puerto Rico, and like short stories all put together to almost create like a novel.
Mm-hmm.
So I was always doing that.
So you've been writing short stories all along. Just so happens that this novel is the first thing that's gotten it become a book.
Yes, because, but I mean,
So you have a collection of stories
almost done
in the works.
Yes,
Some of which predate this book.
that's right.
Okay.
Predate the book and are still dealing with the same characters.
Uh-huh.
I just wrote a story that I'm really happy with that I just finished, which is Lori Mae's mother's story, and her dealing with the grief of his death.
Now, before we started the interview, when we were talking over there, you were talking about how you had to cut a lot of stuff out of the novel. And then you just mentioned during this interview that there's a lot of Lori Mae's story that got cut out.
Yes,
Is some of that stuff that got cut out going to be used in other things?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's my. And I was talking to someone else about this, Raul, a little earlier. I mean, that's the principle is I first learned a lot about writing a short story and what it needed. And then once you do that, then that becomes like the chapter for a novel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're trying to get that narrative arc of a story. So when you pull that stuff out, I go back now, older and hopefully more wiser, more aesthetic experience to apply to it. And there's some stories there that I want to, you know,
'Cause
write.
the reviewer who wrote the review for the Tucson Weekly, who talked about Lori Mae's character, although he didn't name him, he said he would have liked to have known more
Yes.
about Lori Mae's interior life.
Yes.
And so, is it possible we're going to see a short story at some point about Lori Mae?
I'll have to think about that. I don't have one planned yet. But that could definitely be a possibility.
Because
Yeah.
you just said earlier that there was stuff that got cut out.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, because maybe he's also just sort of like, he's also too like, I feel like, you know, like Magdalene was someone I did not know in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was writing the book and I placed this character in there, Magdalene, that's all she was a character. And she was my idealized version of someone I would like to have had as a friend when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the more and more, or that she was like, you know, a twin sister in a way that was separated at birth.
Yeah.
You know, and I kept working with her, and then she became more real. She became a person. I discovered more things about her. So I mean, I think that in a lot of these characters for me too, they're the outgrowth of like me thinking like, what if from my childhood forward I would have turned out in a certain way. So in a way, like Lori Mae is important to me because I actually wrote a lot of stories about him, but then they just didn't come to anything because they felt too emotional and maudlin. But the impulse was there. Was who wants to be the overly sensitive person that could become a writer or an artist, but then everything in life sort of denies and squelches that. You know, so both, you know, a psychic, spiritual death, but you know, but then in this case it becomes real.
Yeah. You've mentioned earlier in the interview about growing up in a bilingual household, and so I'm wondering, and I mentioned this to you yesterday. At some point, I wanted to hear your story on this topic, and this is a good point, I think, to ask this question. Can you talk about your relationship with the Spanish language? Did you grow up bilingual? Did your parents speak to you in Spanish when you were young?
Yes. When I grew up in Hartford, so Hartford, Connecticut has a little Puerto Rico neighborhood. But my mother didn't want to live in Hartford, so she took us out we went out to the edge of West Hartford, another border. We were right on this border. And it was a strange border because all the sewage would come through like a canal by where our house was. Our house was rented from an Italian contractor, so it had a stockade fence around a majority part of it, which had all construction equipment. the house next door was a monument sales office, so it sold gravestones.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else was all industrial, but it was just this little house that this Italian contractor had that was empty, so he would rent it to people. And I could go out in my front yard and look and see the tenements of Hartford. So we were sort of on that border, and I was just riding my bike, making up stories, you know, about the monuments and what it's sitting in a graveyard, all that kind of stuff. And all my dad's friends and family would always come there, and you know, Spanish was predominantly the language. My grandmother would come for long periods of time, usually in the summer, because it's cooler here than there. She would be in the house for a long time. Always at school, kids were either speaking Portuguese or Spanish, and then we'd have to go into class and try to learn in English.
What were you speaking?
Spanish.
Okay, so you
I could do both.
So you were speaking Spanish to your parents?
Yes.
And,
Spanish to my father and English to my mother.
and why English to your mother?
Because my mother's not Puerto Rican.
Oh, okay.
So at that time, it was more like her kind of being silenced, you know? Because it was predominantly his family. And it was sort of kind of wild and crazy.
And how has your relationship to the Spanish language evolved? I mean, where do you stand with it now?
Well, that's the...
I'm thinking of Hunger of Memory and
Yeah,
how
yeah,
he
yeah.
talks about
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
losing it. Was there any analogous experience for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I lost it. I mean, because I can go back to that time and hear, like, so much of it, like, in memory in Spanish, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not a distinct exact full sentences, but that's there.
So as you grew older, usage became less frequent, and therefore you lost it?
Well, when I was in between 4th and 5th grade, my mother, I think, you know, she told my father we can't live here anymore, so we had to move to Michigan. So we came to Michigan, and when we came to Michigan, it just was cut. There was no Spanish in the house anymore. Just him, but he became real, like an exile. He was just like totally alone and withdrawn. And
So there wasn't much verbal communication?
no, and he wouldn't talk, and only with those men across the street or with friends.
So the language you were using was with your mother, and that was English?
Yes,
Ah,
and the school. And then it was all very, you know, this is a little, it's not a city. It's not the vibrancy of people getting together on the streets and you hear the language everywhere. This is like your little house away from everyone else, and, you know, you're just spending all this time alone, and you don't have that.
So with that in mind then, what was it like for you?
And yeah, well, I wanted to add that,
yeah.
I mean, I've written an essay about this, but to go back to the Rodriguez, I mean,
Yeah.
very early when I first came to that class, first day, they were using the same textbooks that we were using on the East Coast. And when I left at the East Coast in the 4th grade, I was reading, supposedly following the colors and the numbers of the books. I was supposedly reading like at a 7th grade level, because I loved these. We would be reading these books and you learn the words and you go fast. And when I got to that class, the teacher said, "That's impossible." And I was, you know, who am I to say it's impossible? And he's like, "We're working at this level, so you'll just have to work at this level."
So they wanted to put you backwards.
Yeah, to be with everyone else. And when I know that when that happened, that it, like now when I think about it, that must have like caused some sort of change for me on the level of language. And then either that day or almost directly after that, a speech pathologist came to the classroom and they took me out in the hall and they made me do like count to 20, do my ABCs. And you know, I have no understanding like why they did that, but now as an adult I know, and as a language, you know, someone who's worked with literacy, I know that they must have done that because I came in with this name, Arroyo,
Yeah.
and they wanted to say, is he a migrant kid?
Yeah.
Who is he? Can he even speak? Should he be in the class? Does he need special education? So it's just those things. It's all part of that just sort of. The way I always want to say is it just sort of killed language. So it wasn't just Spanish; it was English as well. So then once I tried to go to school, where it was predominantly English,
Yeah.
And as I said, I was put in remedial right away.
Yeah.
I just sort of made a click at one point and said, you know, forget this stuff. I'm gonna be the best writer in English that I can be.
Yeah.
You know, I'm gonna
Yeah.
master it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how has it been like for you? I know you've traveled to Spain. You were in Spain for several months, and have you spent extended periods of time in Puerto Rico?
I have not.
You have not.
I went about 14 years ago,
Okay.
and I spent a little over a month.
Okay. Well, then in that case, then when you went to Spain back in 2005 for the several months, what was it like being in a Spanish-speaking country for that period of time? Did some of that childhood Spanish percolate to the surface and reclaim it?
I think so. I think so. I thought it was wonderful. It was new, but it felt really old. It felt like it was inside me. And I would go out, and because I was going there to teach as a faculty member at a university, and usually when other faculty members would go, they would take a year of Spanish,
Yeah.
or at least a semester. So then I would go out with the Spanish colleagues, and it was right away. They said, "So you took a class," and one was a comparative literature guy, and he said, "You took a class in Spanish before you came?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Did you major in Spanish at school?" I said, "No, I took one class in college." He goes, "Man, you're doing like really good. It's like you just like you fit right in here." So I don't know how good it
So you've never
actually-
studied it formally then? You
No,
have not
just
studied
one semester, one or two. Yeah,
it? Mhm.
that was not a fun experience.
The one semester you took?
Yeah.
Why not?
The people were just like, you know, they're racist. They're just, you know, like, you're speaking like, we're doing Castilian Spanish in this class, you know? And, you know, I'm Mexican American, and I'm the teacher of this, and you're Puerto Rican, the way you pronounce those words are bad, you know? It wasn't a good
But you were
experience.
being criticized for speaking
Yeah.
Castilian Spanish?
No, not speaking
Not
Castilian.
speaking
Yeah.
Castilian Spanish. This is a class you took in the States?
Yeah.
Huh.
This wasn't a very warm, you know. I mean, but this happens. It happens to me all the time now. People are like, I feel bad because if I don't pronounce the words right, you know, my Spanish.
Yeah. What about, I mean,
But-
what do you envision, you know, writers are readers, obviously. Do you envision trying to, I mean, do you read in Spanish?
No, I did for a while. And I used to like to, when I was doing lots of poetry and studying it, I had these times where I was working on just like taking short Octavio Paz poems and translating them into my own English. So
So you
my dream is to somehow get the. I feel that if I can come from the background that I come from,
Yeah.
and I don't really care like what people think about the overall book, but I think that if people read it sentence for sentence, which is what most people say, they're like, you know, damn, you were a very fine English stylist. I think if I can come from that background to do that,
Yeah.
I think that my dream would be if I could somehow come up with the funding and live in Spain for a year, or I think that I would like to go like that and just immerse myself totally in Spanish, and I think my language that would come out of that, whether I would write in Spanish or English, I would grow phenomenally in a certain way. But I mean, that's how language works.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's what's so.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong process. I mean,
Yeah.
I lived in Spain for 10 years, grew up speaking Spanish, studied it formally in college, and I go over there, and I still get confused with the subjunctive and genders. So it's a lifelong process. I mean, I speak Spanish, I can read Spanish, I can write Spanish, but I still, despite all that, I still consider English to be my principal language.
Philip Levine has this book called The Bread of Time,
Yeah.
towards an autobiography, and it's this whole thing about him traveling to Spain during Franco's time,
Yeah,
and really
He's milked that experience for a lot.
Yeah. But it's an interesting model to go there and what he was able to take from it. Milk that, yeah.
I'm trying to think. I think we've covered the major topics that we wanted to, so we're doing okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you.
And
So I guess you're going to edit a little bit.
not necessarily.
Oh, because I dropped my mic a couple
We
times.
can edit that.
Okay.